Well, today finds us in Daniel chapter 5 as we make our way through the major prophets. We'll be finishing up this series, which we started last December, I believe. And I pray that it's been not only educational for you, but also encouraging you to get into God's Word yourself, as well as edifying, that is building you up in your own faith. I do appreciate the notes and the sometimes the comments that are left about your Old Testament pages are no longer the clean pages in your Bible. So glad to hear that. Also wanted to thank you. I don't do this enough, but thank those who support the ministry either through prayer, through consuming the content that I'm producing, using it. As well as those who are able to support the ministry financially. Really appreciate it, and your prayers are felt. The money that you contribute is used wisely. I have expenses associated with the online ministry, and you help defray those expenses. I've also got opportunities coming up next year to travel in order to teach, and your contributions will help defray some of the costs of that travel, especially to smaller churches or Bible schools that can't afford to support, bring in a speaker. So I'm able to do that, and I'm happy to do it. So if you're in that group, if you'd like me to come and speak at your church or maybe do a weekend seminar, you're kind of nervous about asking because you don't have a lot of money, just contact me, and there's plenty of brothers and sisters who support the ministry that makes things like that possible. So let's get into Daniel chapter 5. I've called this the handwriting on the wall. If you've read the chapter before, you understand why. If you've forgotten, you'll be reminded. If you don't know, you're about to learn. So what we're looking at here is really there's 23 years that have passed between Daniel chapter 4 and chapter 5. As you can imagine, there's lots and lots of palace intrigue and rivalry that's going on. And when Nebuchadnezzar dies, this all bubbles up. And in a very short period of time, you have really four kings that come and go during this period of time. The king that we encounter in verse 1, Belshazzar, he is the fifth king that comes along here in a very short period of time. And the events here are happening not at the beginning, but at the end of Belshazzar's rule. And we can actually date that pretty accurately in history to October 539 BC. So I'm recording this on October, let me look at the date here, 14th. So just a little more than lots of years and a month ago, these things occurred. So we can really nail these things into history. The outline that we'll be following as we walk through this is the discussion of the feast in verses 1 through 4. And then we see this revelation that comes to Belshazzar, verses 5 through 12. This is followed by the interpretation of this revelation, verses 17 through 28. Then Daniel's reward in verse 29. And the destruction of Babylon in verses 30 and 31. What you're witnessing here is a transition of geopolitical powerhouses. We're moving from the period of time that's been allotted to Babylon, according to God's eternal plan. That's closing out in this chapter, and we are moving into the reign of Persia. Now, this has been predicted in Daniel chapter 2 and again in Daniel chapter 7, so it shouldn't surprise us, but that's what's happening here. So let's get into it. Verses 1 through 4 is about the feast. There's a great big feast going on here. Notice that Belshazzar is drinking wine in the presence of the thousands, so it's a big party. He ordered to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar, his father, or technically it's his great-grandfather, but his father had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem. So these are the things that were mentioned back in chapter 1, verse 2. Remember I said there that they would bring these implements out because there was no idol that represented Yahweh. No idol, that picture that represented the God of Israel. So in order to transport this symbol of Israel's God and his presence to Babylon, they took things that were used to worship him out of the temple and brought him to Babylon. What Belshazzar is doing here, he's ridiculing Israel's God by using these implements of worship for really a base, we could say, a common purpose. So he is ridiculing God in doing this. So as my notes come up here, we see in verse 5 then this revelation, these fingers of a man. It's shocking, it's mysterious. This handwriting just immediately and suddenly appears on the wall here and gets their attention. Look, verse 7. Nebuchadnezzar's alarmed by this and calls for the best and the brightest to come in and tell him what does this mean. Seems to be the common response here when they're confused. They call these best and the brightest, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, the diviners, and they come in. So he's really essentially turning to his pagan faith here. And we're going to see, like all pagan faith, like all faith that's not centered in God, Christ, the object of faith, is what's important. So Belshazzar's faith is going to fail here. Verse 7, this third ruler, this promise that he has to the third ruler, where Belshazzar is the king, his father is still alive at this time. Nabonidus is alive. That's his name, Nabonidus. Hard to pronounce it. So his father's alive. Belshazzar's alive. So the third king will be whoever can interpret this dream. Will be the third most powerful position in the empire. As we go through this in verses 8 and 9, we see that all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known to the king the interpretation. So despite this really lavish, and it seems to me like an impetuous offer of position and wealth, even with this carrot dangling out in front of them, no one can interpret this dream. Verses 10 through 12, the queen enters the banquet hall. I think this is Nebuchadnezzar's wife. Again, surviving her husband, surviving king after king. She comes in. Word, I think, must have spread quickly about what had happened here and how upset the king was. And really, it's God's providence here. We see that she remembers Daniel, a man she described as somebody that has extraordinary spirit, knowledge, insight, and ability. We'd maybe substitute that word extraordinary in verse 12 with supernatural. But by God's grace, God's mercy, it's remembered that Daniel can do this, and she tells that to Belshazzar. So, as a result, Daniel is brought before Belshazzar. He's brought in to see him. In verses 12, King spoke and said, "Are you Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah?" So he's getting Daniel to identify himself. Are you the guy? Am I speaking to the right person here? And then the problem is presented to him. The problem that the best of Babylon have again failed So the king turns to an exile from Judah, the last person perhaps that he would turn to, this exile from Judah. And he asks him to interpret the dream. And again, these riches are dangled in front of Daniel, and he refuses them. He is going to be the spokesman for Yahweh, and he does not need to be enticed to do that. He is not in it for the money. 1 Timothy chapter 6 warns pastors and other church leaders, I think, as well, against the danger of being involved in ministry for money. And I think maybe perhaps this is consistent with what we see in Daniel here. He declines these riches and this position, and he says that he is a spokesman for God, and he's going to make that interpretation known. So in verses 18 through 21, as you go through this, recounts really Nebuchadnezzar's humiliation when he exalted himself before Yahweh. He's brought low, essentially, is what's happening here. In verses 20 through to 24, we see that Nebuchadnezzar hasn't learned from history, or Belshazzar hasn't learned from history. Nebuchadnezzar was brought down. Nebuchadnezzar was humiliated because of his hubris, his pride before the Lord. Belshazzar, in verses 20 through to 24, didn't learn this lesson. You, his son, have not humbled your heart. His arrogance is against Yahweh, and just as it did temporarily for Nebuchadnezzar, it's going to lead to the permanent loss of the empire for Belshazzar. Verses 25 through 28, you'll see Daniel is translating what's been written on the wall here. These are Aramaic words. Could have been, why couldn't they read it? In Aramaic is kind of like Hebrew. You may be surprised to learn that Hebrew didn't lack vowels. Vowels were added later. Most Hebrew words are built on a 3-consonant root. So sometimes with the vowels lacking in Aramaic as they do in Hebrew, the short terse words could have been ambiguous. Could have been maybe they could read the word but don't understand what it means. I think that's what Daniel is doing here. He's saying in verse 28 that 27 through 26 through 28, what the words not only say but what they mean. And basically there's meaning here that Babylon is about to be eclipsed by the Medo-Persian Empire. Now this empire is the chest of arms that were chest and arms of silver in chapter 2. It's the bear in chapter 7, the ram in chapter 8. That God is bringing to pass exactly what he said would happen. So when we come to verse 29 then, as you read through this, you'll see that although Daniel's reward, he had declined it, nevertheless, according to God's providence and according to God's blessing for being obedient, Daniel is again rewarded. But notice, again, kind of ends on a sad note here. Unlike Nebuchadnezzar, who humbled himself or was humbled, Belshazzar doesn't honor Yahweh, but instead that same night he's slain. He's killed in verse 30. Let's go down there. The destruction of Babylon in verses 30 and 31. I said at the beginning of the chapter that this is really rooted in history. And the ancient historian Xenophon reports that Babylon was taken by a surprise attack by the Persians. Xenophon says specifically that while the Babylonians were partying, while they were enjoying a great feast, engaging in revelry and dancing, the way Xenophon puts it, the Persian army drained the Euphrates River, which ran through the city. The river itself then was a barrier, but drained. It made it possible for the Persian soldiers to march right into the city of Babylon, right into the center of the city. And they took over the city without shooting an arrow, we'd say today, without firing a shot. They overran the city before the Babylonians knew what happened. So it concludes in verse 30, 31. Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. So Darius the Mede, this may be an honorific title this for Cyrus. Sometimes there in the ancient Near East there was a title, a name for the emperor, and then a throne name or a throne title that he took on for himself. So Cyrus entered Babylon. And again, we can nail this down, October 29th, 539 BC. So this fulfills the predictions of Babylon's destruction. Not only Daniel's prediction in chapters 2 and 7 and 8, but also the predictions of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Habakkuk. We need to, by way of application for us in the church, we need to pay attention to what Belshazzar from the grave and across thousands of years, 2,500 years of history, is teaching us. Having clear information does not guarantee a right response. You could have all the Bible knowledge that's possible for a person to stuff in their head. But if that doesn't humble you, if that doesn't bring you to a place of humility before the God of the Bible, it's useless. So having good data doesn't necessarily bring about the salvation and the sanctification that God intends. So I pray, brothers and sisters, that as you go through the Word with me, as you are educated and encouraged to be in the Word and maybe learning and gathering a lot of information, you are at the same time being edified. You are being made secure in your salvation. And perhaps if you haven't given your life to Christ, if you haven't honored Him by humbling yourself before Him and admitting that you cannot save yourself, but you must depend solely on Christ for salvation, perhaps you too will be learning from Belshazzar and humble yourself before the God of the universe. God bless you, brothers and sisters. Looking forward to the next chapter, Daniel chapter 6.